behind a sealed palace door, with courtiers moving in whispers and telephones suddenly falling silent, Princess Catherine did something the royal household had prayed she would not do. She broke her silence, not with rage, not with spectacle, but with the kind of calm, controlled words that carry farther than shouting ever could. And the reason, according to those closest to the unfolding crisis, was as personal as it was historic. Catherine had just seen Queen Camilla, wearing one of the most emotionally loaded heirlooms ever associated with Diana, the late Princess of Wales. In that instant, what looked to the public like a simple choice of royal jewelry became something else entirely. It became a question of memory, authority, inheritance, and who truly understands the burden of the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update, because this story is not just about a jewel, not just about one appearance, and not even just about two women standing on opposite sides of a long and painful royal shadow. This is about what happens when the monarchy tries to move forward without fully understanding what the nation still remembers, and what one future queen decided she could no longer leave unanswered. Britain had expected an ordinary royal day. There was a formal appearance, a carefully controlled schedule, a few photographs, and the usual palace choreography that turns even the smallest gesture into a national signal. Then the images began to spread. Camilla stepped into view wearing the heirloom in question, and within minutes the reaction was unlike anything the household had anticipated. Because this was not just any ornament from the vault. In public memory, it belonged to a story that had never really ended. It carried the emotional weight of Diana's image, Diana's era, and Diana's unfinished place inside the royal imagination. That mattered because royal jewels are never only jewels. In palace life, a piece worn on a certain day, before a certain audience, in a certain political and emotional climate becomes a message. Ceremonial symbolism meant more than decoration. It meant precedence, intention, memory, and power. The official household knew that. The private secretaries knew that. The women at the center of this storm knew that. Which is why Catherine's reaction, when it came, did not read as impulsive. It read as the sound of something long restrained finally reaching its limit. The first sign that this was different came not in public but in the way senior aides reportedly moved through Kensington Palace that afternoon. There was no frantic chaos. That would have been easier. Instead, there was discipline, and beneath that discipline, alarm. Catherine had seen the photographs. She had asked one question, then another. Then she had gone quiet in the way those around her have come to recognize as dangerous, not because it meant anger, but because it meant she was thinking beyond the immediate insult and into the meaning of it. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. For Catherine, this was not merely about Camilla. It was not a petty conflict over appearance. It was about what Diana represented to William, to the next generation, and to the delicate emotional settlement that had allowed the monarchy to survive the most painful years of its modern life. Catherine understood something many in the institution still struggled to grasp. Diana was not just history. She was still a living force in the emotional architecture of the crown. Sources close to palace circles say Catherine did not speak at once. She remained composed. She reviewed the day's briefing papers. She listened to explanations. She asked whether the selection had been cleared through the usual channels. She asked whether the implications had been considered. She asked whether anyone had thought about William. Those questions mattered because they revealed where her mind had gone immediately, not to image management, not to press reaction, but to the son who had spent much of his adult life learning how to carry both the monarchy and his mother's memory without allowing either to destroy the other. William, by then, had already seen the same photographs, and those who know him say his reaction was immediate in a way Catherine's was not. He had expected poor judgment from time to time. He had not expected this, not this symbol, not now, not after years of careful effort to keep certain emotional boundaries intact. No one raised their voice, but the silence deepened. That silence inside a royal residence can be more frightening than a public argument, because it means everyone in the room understands that the matter has moved beyond preference and into principle. What made it more explosive was timing. This was not a random moment in the royal calendar. The family had already been under visible strain. Questions about succession, continuity, public trust, and the health of the institution had been hanging in the air for months. Preparation was the word used in palace court orders. Preparation for future roles. Preparation for changing burdens. Preparation for what the monarchy would look like under William and Catherine. That is why the appearance of that heirloom was received not as a wardrobe choice, but as a challenge to emotional order inside the House of Windsor. Catherine's silence had become, over time, one of her strongest forms of power. She did not rush to defend herself. She did not answer every insult. She did not step into every emotional trap laid by the public drama surrounding the family. Yet silence in royal life is never empty. It gathers meaning. It becomes a form of discipline. It becomes a signal that one is preserving the institution by refusing to inflame it. So when Catherine finally chose to speak, even in carefully measured language, the household understood something had changed. But to understand why this moment struck so deeply, the story did not begin there. It did not begin with those photographs, and it did not begin that morning. The decision to break silence was born from something older, buried beneath years of forced civility and ceremonial restraint. What happened next requires going back to a quieter incident, one that never fully entered the public record but left a mark on everyone involved. Months earlier, during a private planning discussion connected to a major state occasion, a disagreement had taken place over the use of family symbols tied to past royal figures. It was not dramatic on the surface. There were folders, seating charts, heritage notes, wardrobe proposals, and the normal machinery of palace preparation. The official household was there. Senior dress advisors were there. Private office representatives were there. In royal terms, it was routine. Yet beneath the routine lay a dangerous question. Who had the right to embody what the public still believed belonged, morally if not legally, to Diana's legacy? At that earlier meeting, Catherine had reportedly made her position plain in language that was courteous but unmistakable. Some pieces, she argued, required emotional intelligence as much as protocol. Some objects could not be understood merely through ownership records. They existed in the nation's mind as part of a living memory. To use them carelessly would not modernize the monarchy. It would wound it. She was not making a legal claim. She was making a moral one. And those are often the claims that frighten institutions most, because institutions know how to answer rules. They do not know how to answer grief. That warning, it now seems, was either ignored, minimized, or quietly outvoted. The truth was more painful. Palace systems are built to absorb discomfort. A private objection can be filed away as sensitivity. A concern can be treated as timing. A warning can be converted into a note for later review. That is how institutions survive. But it is also how they sometimes walk directly into avoidable crises. By the time Camilla appeared wearing Diana's historic heirloom, what Catherine was seeing was not only the item itself. She was seeing proof that something she had tried to prevent had happened anyway. The immediate confrontation was not between Catherine and Camilla. That is what many outside the palace misunderstand. Royal conflict is rarely handled in the most direct line. It moves through spouses, secretaries, senior advisors, and carefully controlled conversations where every word is both personal and constitutional. William was the one who took the first step. He requested clarity. A request for clarity in that environment is never only a request. It is a warning that patience has ended. Those briefed on the matter say William sought a private conversation with his father. Not a ceremonial meeting, not a family lunch. A private discussion, closed door, no unnecessary staff, no room for polite evasion. Father and son have had many difficult conversations in their lives, but this one cut close to the deepest unresolved fault line between them. The difference between moving on and appearing to erase what came before. Charles had spent years trying to stabilize the monarchy after storms that threatened to define it forever. William, however, had spent those same years making peace with the fact that stability achieved at the cost of memory would never feel like peace at all. He had expected concern. He had not expected resistance. Yet resistance, according to palace whispers, is what he met at first. Not outright refusal, not coldness, but the familiar language of institutional reasoning. The peace, he was told, had been available. The occasion was appropriate. The selection complied with internal practice. No offense had been intended. In any ordinary family, those explanations might have settled the matter. But the monarchy could survive many things, not this kind of emotional blindness. Not when its future depended on appearing to understand the public heart better than its own procedures did. Catherine, during this time, did something remarkable. She did not inflame William's anger. She sharpened it into purpose. That has always been one of her most underestimated strengths. Where others see gentleness, the institution has repeatedly encountered steadiness. She reminded him that this could not become a shouting match about personalities. It had to remain a question of what the crown means when it says it respects the past. That mattered because once a royal dispute becomes personal, the palace can manage it as a family matter. But if it becomes symbolic, it becomes dangerous. Symbols belong to the nation. Then Catherine made the choice that changed the entire course of the story. She agreed that silence would no longer protect the institution if silence now looked like surrender. This was not a declaration of war. It was a calculation. A royal statement, even an indirect one, would signal that some boundaries still existed, that memory still had guardians, that the future Princess of Wales understood the emotional constitution of the monarchy better than those who believed a vault inventory could settle the matter. A state communication was more than a press note. It was a controlled act of meaning, and meaning was now the battlefield. Before any public line was approved, another critical scene unfolded. Charles and Camilla spoke privately. No one outside that room can know every word, but those familiar with palace history understand the emotional stakes at once. Camilla had spent decades enduring public hostility, suspicion, comparison, and the endless burden of occupying a space forever shaped by Diana's absence. She had fought, quietly and methodically, to become accepted not as a rival memory, but as a working part of the monarchy's present. To be told once again that certain symbols remained untouchable was not merely frustrating, it was humiliating. And yet the institution around her understood the danger. This was not about whether Camilla had a formal right to wear a particular heirloom. It was about whether she should have done so, knowing the emotional terrain on which the monarchy still stood. That difference between right and wisdom is the difference that decides royal crises. Charles, for all his experience, now faced the cruelest version of a dilemma he had known all his life. Husband or heir, present companionship or continuity, private loyalty or public legitimacy. The decision was not born that evening alone. It was fed by older fears, older wounds, and the unmistakable reality that William and Catherine represented not simply the next chapter, but the chapter in which the monarchy would either renew trust or lose a generation emotionally. Continuity planning began to move in the background. Continuity meant the methods by which the institution prepares for transfer, illness, absence, and future reign. Advisors reviewed risks. Household channels were tested. Language was drafted and redrafted. The Lord Chamberlain's office, guardian of ceremonial order, was said to be drawn into quiet discussions over precedent, symbolism, and how to contain what was rapidly becoming more than a family disagreement. This is where the story took its most revealing turn. Catherine's eventual statement was never intended as an attack. That is precisely why it landed so hard. She did not name Camilla. She did not accuse anyone of malice. She did something far more devastating. She spoke about remembrance, responsibility, and the sacred difference between inheritance and appropriation. Those words traveled like fire through Britain because everyone knew what they meant. She framed memory not as possession but as stewardship. And in doing so, she made the palace look as though it had confused access with understanding. The line, according to those who heard it before release, was breathtaking in its control. She said that some legacies are not carried by jewels alone, but by the lives, sacrifices, and love attached to them, and that honoring them requires care, humility, and an awareness of what they still mean to others. It was not loud, it was not bitter, but it was unmistakable. The future queen had broken silence, and she had done so in a way that elevated the issue beyond rivalry and into moral authority. The reaction was immediate. Broadcasters shifted tone. Commentators who had expected another ordinary palace day suddenly found themselves discussing emotional legitimacy, historical sensitivity, and whether the monarchy still understood the enduring force of Diana's memory. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, not in anger alone, but in fascination. Newspapers rushed out digital editions. Television panels filled with former aides, historians, etiquette experts, constitutional observers, and those strange palace interpreters who emerge only when the House of Windsor begins to tremble. The headlines varied, but their meaning was the same. Catherine had spoken, and Britain was listening. What shocked many observers was not the existence of tension. That tension had always been there. What shocked them was who now seemed to command the emotional center of the story. Not the reigning king, not the queen at his side, but Catherine. Calm, reluctant, measured Catherine, who, by speaking so little for so long, had made every word matter more. In that moment, she did not look like a junior royal carefully staying within bounds. She looked like the woman already thinking in terms of the institution's future moral survival. Inside the family, the effect was even sharper. Some felt she had done what no one else had been willing to do. Others believed a dangerous line had been crossed. Because once one senior royal implies that another has mishandled a symbolic legacy, the matter cannot easily be sealed again. The palace lives on surfaces. It requires the illusion that private pain can always be subordinated to public order. Catherine's statement threatened that illusion, not by exposing secrets, but by reminding the country that private pain is often the real engine beneath royal ceremony. Camilla, by all accounts, was deeply wounded by the backlash, not because she had never faced criticism before, but because this criticism came wrapped in something harder to answer than hostility. It came wrapped in sorrow. Public anger can be dismissed as partisan or emotional. Public sorrow is more dangerous. Sorrow implies disappointment. It implies that something sacred has been handled without tenderness. That is why this crisis did not feel like tabloid noise. It felt like a moral disappointment at the center of the monarchy. Charles now had to do what kings rarely enjoy doing in public or private. He had to arbitrate between pain that was old and pain that was current. Camilla's suffering was real. Years of endurance had not erased it. But William's and Catherine's position was real too. Diana's image still stood at the emotional threshold of the modern monarchy. To mishandle that image was to tamper with the most sensitive inheritance the royal family possessed. Not the crown jewels, not the palaces, not the titles. The inheritance was trust, fragile, wounded, incomplete trust. That was the deeper issue Catherine seems to have understood from the beginning. The monarchy does not operate only by law. Succession is a legal framework, yes. A succession defines who follows whom, how authority passes, how continuity is preserved. But legitimacy is emotional as well as constitutional. A future king and queen must inherit not only office, but moral confidence. Catherine recognized that if the palace appeared careless with Diana's memory, it would not be Camilla alone who paid the price. It would be the future reign itself. And she refused to let that happen in silence. As the hours passed, efforts were made to calm the storm. Clarifications were floated. Friendly voices suggested there had been no slight, no hidden motive, no deliberate provocation. That may well have been true. Yet, intent was no longer the point. The public had already attached meaning to the moment, and Catherine's words had sealed that meaning. This was not about a mistake in styling. It was about the battle between institutional permission and emotional wisdom. It was about whether the royal family could still tell the difference. There were further conversations. William again met his father. This time, those around the process say, the tone was less defensive and more sober. Charles is no stranger to the burden of symbolism. He has spent a lifetime being misread, misunderstood, criticized, mocked, and eventually, in part, vindicated. But this was different. He was not facing a hostile press cycle. He was facing a warning from the very people who would carry the monarchy after him. Preparation over denial. That was the principle now pressing on the palace walls. One figure said to have played an important quiet role was Princess Anne. Anne has long occupied a singular position in royal life. She is not ornamental. She is not sentimental in public. She is the institution in human form, disciplined, unspectacular, relentless. When Anne becomes concerned, others tend to listen. According to whispers from within the palace sphere, she did not dramatize the matter. She distilled it. The issue, she reportedly argued, was not whether anyone meant harm. The issue was whether the family had once again underestimated how deeply the country still feels what it does not always say aloud. That kind of intervention matters because Anne speaks the language both William and Charles understand. She speaks duty, she speaks consequence, she speaks survival. And survival, in this case, required the palace to accept a humiliating truth. The future had now publicly corrected the present. The younger generation had shown greater instinct for national feeling than parts of the senior household. That is not a small embarrassment in a monarchy. It is a warning about where moral authority is already moving. Meanwhile, Catherine remained publicly composed. There was no dramatic follow-up, no string of escalating remarks, no indulgence in public grievance. That restraint only strengthened her position. She had said enough, more than enough. The silence after her words became part of their force. No one raised their voice, but the country could hear the strain inside the House of Windsor all the same. It heard the old ghost of Diana move once more through the palace corridors. It heard a future queen drawing a line around memory itself. The hidden cruelty of this crisis was that each central figure was, in a different way, trying to protect something. Camilla was protecting her dignity and her place in a life she had fought to build. Charles was protecting his marriage and the stability of a reign already burdened by relentless scrutiny. William was protecting his mother's memory and the emotional truth of his own life. Catherine was protecting the future. This was not villain against victim. It was protection colliding with protection, until one of them had to give way. Yet the country, as always, simplified what the palace made complicated. To many ordinary viewers, the story felt immediate and clear. Diana's memory had been touched clumsily. Catherine had answered with grace. William had stood where the public expected him to stand. Camilla, fairly or unfairly, had walked back into a symbolic space that much of Britain never believed truly belonged to her. That was the public reading. Inside the institution, the truth was harder because it demanded something palaces dislike most: an admission that emotional history cannot be managed solely through protocol. As night fell, advisors refined the damage control options. Some urged silence. Others favored a softer palace line emphasizing continuity and shared family respect. But the energy had already shifted. Catherine's intervention meant the family could no longer pretend this was an internal matter of styling and scheduling. The leak had become the event. The event had become a national conversation, and the national conversation had become, unmistakably, a referendum on how the monarchy intends to carry Diana into the future without either exploiting her memory or pretending it no longer governs anything. The next day brought the scene many will remember for years. William and Catherine appeared together. No grand speech, no theatrical gesture, just controlled presence. Yet in royal life, presence is speech. Their expressions were composed, but not cold. Their posture said what the palace could not quite articulate. They were not rejecting the institution. They were assuming responsibility for it. This was not rebellion. It was succession in emotional form. The future was not waiting politely in the background anymore. It was beginning to define the terms. Observers noticed Catherine's choice of attire with intense scrutiny, as they always do, but this time the scrutiny carried unusual emotional charge. She did not compete symbolically. She did not answer display with display. She chose restraint. That mattered, because restraint became her answer to what many saw as excess. In that decision lay the core of her power. She did not need to reclaim Diana through imitation. She reclaimed meaning through conduct. And conduct in royal history is what lasts after the headlines fade. For Charles, the emotional cost was visible even without words. A king is expected to stand above private weather. But kings are also fathers, husbands, sons, and aging men who know that every unresolved family pain becomes sharper under institutional light. This crisis exposed the hardest truth of his reign, that the past has not remained in the past, and that the bridge between his monarchy and William's future monarchy cannot be built unless the emotional legacy of Diana is handled with reverence, not merely administration. In the days that followed, palace language softened. There were signs of recalibration. Briefings became more careful. Symbolic planning reportedly tightened. Heirloom use, ceremonial visibility, and legacy items connected to emotionally sensitive figures were subjected to greater review. That is how the palace admits error when it cannot say the word error. It changes procedure. Bureaucracy is often monarchy's apology. And in this case, procedure was the quiet settlement after a storm of feeling. But settlements do not erase what has been revealed. What had been revealed here was profound. Catherine was no longer being seen merely as William's partner or as a model of decorum. She was being seen as a guardian of royal meaning. A guardian does not always shout. A guardian notices what others dismiss. A guardian understands that symbols are not small things in a family whose survival depends on symbol more than almost any other public institution on earth. She had read the moment, measured the cost of silence, and then spoken exactly enough. That is why this story has traveled so far and so fast. It is not simply because it involves Diana. It is not simply because it involves Camilla. It is because, beneath the immediate shock, the nation sensed something larger. It sensed the future testing the present. It sensed a quiet transfer of moral gravity. It sensed that when the next reign comes, it may be shaped less by legal transition than by the emotional choices already being made in moments like this. The monarchy has always survived by absorbing contradiction, duty and love, ceremony and sorrow, continuity and change. But some contradictions can only be managed for so long before one side demands recognition. Catherine's silence had once protected the institution. Her voice, in this moment, may have protected it more. Because protection is not always concealment. Sometimes protection means telling the truth in a form the institution can bear. Sometimes it means refusing to let history be handled carelessly just because no one intended harm. And so the final image of this crisis may not be Camilla wearing the heirloom, nor even Catherine's words themselves. It may be something quieter and more powerful than either. A royal family forced, once again, to confront the fact that memory is not neutral. A future queen standing in that knowledge without bitterness. A future king understanding that his private pain has now become part of public duty. And a reigning king realizing that the road to continuity does not run around the past. It runs through it. There is a reason these moments grip the country so deeply. People do not watch royal drama only for jewels, titles, or headlines. They watch because the monarchy turns human pain into national theater, and national theater back into constitutional meaning. In that strange exchange, every gesture matters more than it should. Every silence speaks too loudly, and every attempt to move on is judged against what the public refuses to forget. Diana remains part of that judgment. She always will. If Catherine's words accomplished anything lasting, it was this. They reminded the palace that remembrance is not weakness. It is part of legitimacy. To remember properly is to govern emotion with honor. To ignore that truth is to invite confusion where continuity should stand. The future was acknowledged without ending the present, but the message was unmistakable. Some boundaries are not made of law or locks or inventory lists. They are made of love, loss, and the collective memory of a nation. For Camilla, the lesson was painful. For Charles, it was sobering. For William, it was deeply personal. For Catherine, it was clarifying. And for the monarchy itself, it may yet prove essential, because the crown can endure scandal, debate, criticism, and change. What it cannot endure is the sense that it has forgotten where the public still hurts. That is why this was not a small palace misunderstanding. It was a test of whether the institution still knows the emotional price of its own history. In the end, no crown changed hands, no title was stripped, no public feud was declared. Yet something important shifted all the same. The monarchy chose preparation over denial. It was reminded that continuity does not mean flattening memory, and that authority without sensitivity quickly becomes fragility in ceremonial dress. Catherine did not break royal silence to create chaos. She broke it because silence at that moment had become too costly. And in doing so, she may have shown the family exactly what the next era of monarchy will demand. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.